We as a church have partnered with this organization called the Global Immersion Project. There are a couple of guys that I believe the story is that they were I'm getting stories mixed up now. I don't know exactly what the story is, but they were on a border, because I'm thinking the Bible Project, so totally something different from this. But two guys were involved in peacemaking and found that this was both an identity that Jesus teaches and preaches and invites us into as the church, but that this is something that this world deeply, deeply needs, and this world deeply, deeply does not understand. And so the role of peacemaker essentially is bridging between areas of conflict and finding a solution and finding a space where both sides can be seen and heard, and identity in the middle is that space. And so for us, we've been partnering with the Global Immersion Project for a number of years. One of the founders, John Huckins, branched off into different work, but he started this nonprofit called The Journey Home. In that nonprofit is an opportunity to venture into, at least for that one, what our church partnered with is the border in the US-Mexico border. So if you guys aren't aware of that, that is a political talking point for decades. And that has not changed as far as what's happening on the ground there. And so for us, it's been an opportunity to see, to listen, and ultimately to learn and be shaped. And so today we're gonna share. Typical churches would call this Mission Report Sunday. Might be the same for us, but our mission isn't to go out and do stuff for people. It's to go out and listen and be present to places where Christ might be, and to really glean from that. And so I'm gonna invite up Katie, Sonia, and Tanya, and they're gonna share. So yeah, come on up. And as they share today, I just want to invite us, would we take that same posture? Would we be present? Would we listen? And ultimately, would we lean into perhaps where Jesus might be in the midst of all of this? So.
Awesome. Thanks, Jay. So my name's Katie, and we did this trip back in February. And so some of you may remember that, and we talked a lot about it, and some of you were able to join us for a lunch where we debriefed some of this with you all. And so we're really grateful for the church to give us an opportunity to share in this context. And part of that, too, is that a lot of you supported us through prayer and financially so that we could go on this. And so we want to acknowledge the part you played and have you hear some of our reflections so that you can continue to be a part of what this experience was. So the first thing we're going to talk about is why we went, so you have a little context. And for me, I feel like this has been a long time coming. I grew up in Southern California in a community that had a large Mexican population, and I had never been to Mexico until November of 2023. So it never really had an opportunity. But I was very aware of people coming from Mexico and the dynamics on the border. Actually, when I moved to Orange County, my older brother got connected with Solidarity, and he told me, like, hey, there's this great organization. I could talk to you later, but Orange County was not a place I ever wanted to live. And my brother was like, no, there's some really great people doing some amazing work. And so lots of things, connections there, but I currently live in one of the neighborhoods on the other side of Fullerton that Solidarity partners with. And I work at Cal State Fullerton and work with a lot of first-generation college students. And so this theme of immigrants and people coming to the U.S. has continued to be a call and kind of a stirring in me. And so in 2023, kind of looking at that year, I just really felt like this is a year I need to make it to the border. A lot of you have been on these trips with border immersion, with global immersion. I'd heard about it, and I kind of spoke that out, and I was like, this is the year I need to at least drive to San Diego by myself and stand on the border, right? Like, I can do that. And so through some movement and different conversations with Vanessa, we were able to go in November as kind of a scouting trip for me to just get some exposure, and that led to us going on this trip in February. So I feel like there's a lot of pieces, and then the pieces came together, and I was able to go this time.
Okay. Hi, everyone. So why did I go? I think a lot of myself was surprised that I said yes. My husband, Jay, who had been encouraging me when it came up to go was surprised when I said yes. And I think those who know me probably were like, "Oh, you're going?" I'm like, "Yeah, I'm going." But it was really God's prompting, and I had shared this in our smaller group. But God, if you guys know me, I'm like Type A. Things are in the calendar. I kind of have to have like things in a row, and God was like, "Bam, calendar's open. Bam, you have a sub." Like it was just really, God was saying, "I'm, I'm opening it for you. It's, you're the only one who's gonna hold you back." So Jay had actually gone on this trip previously a couple years ago, and I had stayed home with the kids. And this time it was kind of flip-flop where, the kids are older, and, I was able to go, and Jay stayed home with the kids. And it was like a shared experience after that I could really appreciate what he had shared with me years back. And so that was just another piece of after. But anyways, yeah. So when it was first prompted that this trip was happening, it didn't really click for me. But when Katie came up and said she was going to be kind of like the part of the team leading, something just kind of like added to that. So God really brought Katie there to kind of solidify, like, you can do this, and then Sonia. So when I heard Sonia was coming out, and Sonia's like pretty new to our church, and I've been around for a while, right, since One Life. So I was like, man, I'm like so encouraged. So I think it was just a lot of factors, but yeah.
For me, I at first did not want to go. And then I found out that the trip is not what I traditionally conceived of as a mission trip, which is to drop in somewhere and solve somebody's problems. And I found out that rather this trip was for purposes of learning. I felt drawn to it inwardly. I didn't know why, and after thinking, I realized I was drawn to it because border issues, immigration issues, they do not touch my daily life at all. But I felt inwardly drawn to it. I realized because I feel solidarity with people who have negative stereotypes against them. And so I thought, I want to go, I want to experience in person and learn in person.
So we're going to show a couple pictures right now of us actually there to prove we went. So here is us on the Tijuana side of the border. And then the next picture is the group that we went with. We were able to join a church from the Bay Area that was going. And so we were able to be a part of their group, which I think was really great for all of us. They were really warm and welcomed us. And it allowed financially for it to work, for us to be a part of this bigger group. So now hopefully we're going to try to show you a video that Journey Home made that kind of summarizes and gives you a bit of a feel of the different places that we went. So hopefully that gives you a bit of a feel of the physical places that we went, some of the people that we went with. We're going to hopefully get back to some slides of our actual agenda just so that you can see that amount of things that we did. So the first day we were in the San Diego side, and we went to Borderfield State Park. We met with a Border Patrol agent and got to hear his perspective and his viewpoints, which was very interesting because he was a very open, professing Christian. And so hearing the perspective from him as a Border Patrol agent gave us a lot to reflect on. And then we were able to meet with some formerly deported immigrants who were now on the San Diego side and got to hear their long story. We got to go to an amazing Colombian restaurant for lunch that was in the neighborhood that John lives in. And then we got to hear from an immigration policy expert and went to Chicano Park, which is a park in San Diego with a bunch of murals that you'll hear about later. And then the second day, we actually went down to Tijuana, and we were able to go to a migrant shelter, and we went to a couple different areas, and then we actually went to the coast where the border wall goes into the ocean, which you saw some images of that, and did some different processing on that side and hearing from someone who lives on the Tijuana side and works closely with Journey Home. So it was a lot of pretty intense things and lots of learning, and then it was like the end of the day, and it was like, go have dinner and process, and we're all like, what just happened? But it was a lot of just really intentional, as Sonia said, learning and hearing from different perspectives and getting to see different points of view. So I'm going to pass it over to Sonia, and we're going to each share now some highlights, things that have kind of stuck out for us from the trip.
Next slide. Quick intro. This was one of my first views of the wall. When I texted a picture of the wall to my family, they said, "What? There's an actual wall?" So, yes, there is. And in fact, what I didn't know is that in many places there are two walls because one wall was not enough to keep people out. Next slide, please. This is the end of the wall that goes into the ocean. If you took this picture and then turned around to see the scene, what's going on this side of the wall, it's very lively. There are food trucks and restaurants, lots of people, there are beaches, monuments and statues. There's a big garden going on that people are building. There's a lot of colorful murals being painted. And then if you look through the wall to the America side, that's the next slide. This is me sticking my face in between the slats of the wall, and I was a bit breathtaken by the stark contrast of this lively, very one-sided scene and looking into the other side that is such a vast beach, and in the distance, you can see downtown San Diego, which is relatively familiar to me, and it was a little bit breathtaking to have that stark contrast. So some of the experience that I'll highlight for you, if you go to the next slide. This is Chicano Park. When I first walked in, I thought those were arches, but they are not. It's a freeway overpass, and that has to do with the history of what happened. This is a Mexican-American community, and basically the government promised them a park, but instead, one after another, families were displaced so that the government could put in things like a police station, and then something else, and then a freeway overpass, and then a bridge. And then they came in with more bulldozers to put in a parking structure, and the community said, that's enough. And they all rallied around and made human chains around the bulldozers for 12 days until they reached agreement to keep the park. So these murals are commemorative of the Mexican culture and the protests that occurred, and to commemorate this community that was basically overlooked and seen as very dispensable by the surrounding community. One thing that happened while we were there is that one member of our group, we were just walking around, praying, reflecting. She looked into a room where they were painting something, and she was met with great hostility. And she was very taken aback, understandably. But I do also understand the perspective of these painters who probably felt like, I am not your spectacle and I'm not in your entertainment. This is my expression of my place in this world. And so I understand that that's probably what was happening, and that's why I feel like learning the history of what happened is important, because without the context of the history, this isolated incident could easily be misunderstood and could have escalated into a hostile situation, and that would be so unnecessary. Next slide, please. This is Pedro. We listened to one of his talks. He came and talked about his organization. They find people who are climbing over the wall, and he finds them often in very injured and unsafe situations, and he helps them. He also advocates legislatively and administratively to help people apply for asylum and around policies. For example, you need a very specific app on your phone in order to apply for asylum, and you need to be in a very specific physical location in order for that app to work, things like that. And you can only have one bag, and oftentimes that bag gets stolen. So he finds people in very desperate situations. He said that psychological studies show that when people are 18 to 22 feet in the air, that is when you become disoriented. The wall used to be 18 feet high, and they changed it to become 30 feet high. And on top of that, there's the wall, and then there's an overhang that comes out onto the Mexico side to make it virtually impossible to scale the wall and clip over that overhang. And so he said the number of deaths have increased lately, even though the number of migrants has decreased. So I was very struck by the intensity of the injuries that he's describing, and the extreme lengths that people go to put themselves in these dire and desperate situations. And I was just overwhelmed, actually, after his talk, thinking, what is driving people to put themselves into these really extreme situations? And obviously, it's so overwhelming and complicated to think about that. Another thing he mentioned was that he feels that in this advocacy work, a lot of the language that is driving these policies of closing the border, increasing border patrol, these things are meant to decrease migration. And he said that there is a language of Christo-fascist language that is driving the spirit behind this. Next slide, please. This is a migration center that we visited. Our host, named Alejandra, she was a wonderful person. She said that this center is one that does it well. So I can only imagine there may be many who do not do it well. They receive people from all over the world. Many show up and they have nowhere to stay, and they have no timeline because they don't know what will happen or when or if anything will ever happen. Sometimes people can go through all that process to apply and get an appointment 7 months out, things like that. One theme that generally kept coming up was just how unrelenting this uphill battle is to get people processed, get people into safe conditions, get people the things that the government has promised them. And although people do come from all over the world, some of the generally named groups are people from Central and South America and from Haiti. And she said, all of this uphill battle was reversed when the Ukrainian refugees started coming. And she said that all the activist workers saw this opposite attitude of outpouring of welcome for the Ukrainians. And she said all the activists were, quote unquote, appalled. And just to give you one example, one of the people that we talked to that you saw in the video, they were parents who were separated from their children for many years. And this mom is describing that she can still hear the cries in her head of all these children in the detention centers who are not with their parents and don't know where they are. But when the Ukrainian refugees came, each person got a special QR code for their dog or cat to make special sure that they could be reunited as soon as possible with their pet. So those were some of my highlights. I will turn it over to Tanya.
Tanya. Okay, next slide. Next slide, please. So going into this trip, it was definitely just coming in kind of open book, not really sure what to expect, other than knowing that this is more of a learning trip. So, but I had my reservations, like what am I going to see? What am I going to hear? Who am I going to talk to, or what am I going to experience? And I had kind of a bit of nervousness about that. And definitely we did hear some really heartbreaking stories and whatnot, and especially when we were actually outside of the detention center. We weren't allowed to go in, which I was actually grateful, because I think if we were able to go in, I don't think I could have held it together. But even just being outside and seeing it looked like a jail, like a prison, and you're thinking like the humanity wasn't there, This is on the state side, right? Anyways, so there was ups and downs. The trip was fast. Like they packed it in. Journey Home did a really, really excellent job of planning things out, where we were just there to be present, and we didn't have to worry about transportation, language, where we're eating, where we're going. It was all very taken care of, and we were just there to they said, be present, reflect. They gave us questions to ponder while we're listening. So this is the one of the migrant shelter that we visited, and we got to go inside and speak to the workers. We did not see any residents because they wanted to keep their privacy, obviously. But we got to talk to the workers and just seeing the artwork throughout this trip, the murals, just presented a lot of hope in the darkness, right? Like they have so much right to be so feel hopeless, right? But people are there are turning around and saying, they're helping each other. And we also, in the video that we passed close to John Huckins' house was this community center where in that community center was Border Angels. And I had never heard about this group before, but basically they do treks out into the desert to do water drops and food drops because they know that there are migrants going through the desert and perishing because of the environment. So the humanity is there and their hope is there in those situations. So next slide, please. One of the murals from Chicano Park, and like from the brokenness, right? They took ownership and made something beautiful. And these murals are being restored. The ones that are old, they're getting restored. New ones are getting painted, and so it's ongoing. This legacy of like, this is us, and we have a voice, right? That was visually very like beautiful. So this whole trip was like up and down, but I saw a lot of beauty, and that was really like encouraging. Next slide, please. Yes. So like you can see the top of the wall, what Sonia said, they had that extra piece, which is very unnecessary because you probably couldn't even climb that 30-foot wall anyways. But visually, like, oh, and cherry on top, like, oh yeah, you don't even try. But people said like people don't even try to climb over the wall at this point because there's border patrol everywhere, and it's so visible, right? The day we got there, they had just literally that morning finished the end of the wall, the revamp, I guess they call it, whatever they did, and a group right away was already painting, because before this there were different murals painted. It's not a flat wall. It's like beams, right? They're like this far apart or whatnot, but they put it together so that it looks. You can put a mural on it, and the pictures that I had seen that Jay had taken are different because that was the old wall taken down. Here's the new wall, but you know what? We're gonna go out and we're gonna make it our own and use our voice. So these artists are coming out and they're painting, and this was it's like pink erasers, if you can kind of tell. So they were in the middle of it, so I kind of curious of how it looks now, but it's like Eraser Man. So we can see the artists there, and they invited some of the people from our group to be part of that and painted a little bit. But you can see like the art really spoke out to me. So, next slide.
So for me, a couple of the things that stood out is this. This is a mural from Chicano Park, and I kind of zoomed in. I don't know if you can see it, but it says, "We didn't cross the borders, the border crossed us." And I think that this really just stood out to me as kind of a reminder of the way borders and countries are created throughout history, right? Like sometimes I think literally people took like pens to maps and just like cut out things. And that it's just complicated, right? Because like where we are right now used to be Mexico. So if we're talking about borders and immigrants, and it's just complex. And I think that this statement really just stood out to me of like, man, we have to take a breath and think about the history and think about the layers that adds to this conversation, because some people have been in this land before those borders were made, and so it just really struck me. The next picture is also down at the border wall. This is all on the Tijuana side, and I know enough Spanish to know that this means basically like united with or without borders, right? And so this is a statement. And again, like Tanya just said, there's some hope here of like, but it's almost like it is hope, like this wish out there, right? Like, could we be united with or without borders? What would that look like? Because clearly we're not united and there are borders, but this sentiment really struck me. The next picture is of the wall, and as Tanya said, when we were there, there was literally still wet cement from the new portion of the wall that they had built. And this trip was in February, and when I was there previously in November, it was the old wall. And so just in a couple months' time, it had totally changed. So you can't really see, but through the slats is the old wall on the other side, which is like rusty and red. The next slide shows you like there's still the supports there with the new wall. So that was just striking for us. Like they're like, really this morning they were still building this wall. So we're realizing how this is an ongoing thing. I think the next picture shows the detention center that Tanya mentioned. I think this was one of the things that stuck out most to me and starts to build into kind of my reflections and some of my takeaways. We drove for a while out into eastern, a little bit farther east in San Diego County, and this detention center is just where there's a bunch of Amazon warehouses and things like very out of the way. Like you wouldn't go here on accident, you wouldn't see it. And the stories that we were told about from when they were able to go into the detention center on previous trips, and with COVID, some of the policies that were put in place that they kind of have continued to use as reasons why people can't come in. And so even just standing there, the stories that we heard about the way the detention centers are operated, as Sonia was sharing with the asylum process, with the detention process, there's often like not a lot of help for people that are in there. So people are often there without knowing exactly why or how long they're going to be there. They use some term like refrigerator that is just like super cold in there and very like sterile, like prison-ish. And some people in our group from the Bay Area Church did some research. And you may have remembered, some of you may have heard some of this a couple years ago. It was in the news a lot more. But a lot of these detention centers are run by contracted companies for the government. And so they actually get money based on how many beds are filled in the detention centers, right? So there's an incentive financially to have people in the detention center and to not move them along. And they did some research on this company, and at least what they found was not very hopeful as far as the intent of this organization that ran these detention centers for the government. And so I think what really struck me about this is the point was made that this is purposely out of the way so that we don't see it, we don't know about it. We hear about it in the news every once in a while when people bring a spotlight to it, and then we go back to our lives, and it's easy to forget. But that's intentional, that we're not aware. The next picture is of Borderfield State Park, and this is on the San Diego side. And I was actually very hopeful when Vanessa and I went in November. We weren't able to access this because there had been some big storms that has caused some flooding. And so Borderfield State Park was closed. And so I was really hoping when we went back in February that we would be able to go. But this is as close as we could get. As you saw in Sonia's picture, the beach is just wide open. Like you can't really access it on the California side. And there is some flood damage, I'm sure. And there is some runoff from the Tijuana River that's not totally sanitary. But the feeling I got, and just from being in that area, is they don't want people there. I mean, like I have a state park pass, and I was like ready to go visit the state park, right? And like go check it out and be as close as I could, but you're not able to go. And so we went to this parking lot where the Border Patrol agent met us, but that whole area was patrolled. There were helicopters, and part of it is that there's like a Navy base nearby, so between the military and the Border Patrol, there's people on quads, there's people in trucks. It was not like come and have a beach day at Borderfield State Park. You know, it was like, please don't be here. I had my little car and we got stuck in mud and we had to park kind of on the side of the road. And we parked just like in the bushes, and within like 2 minutes, a Border Patrol guy came up and he was very friendly, you know, and I was like, is it okay if we park here? And he's like, yeah, we're not gonna give you a ticket, I don't care. But just the fact that they knew we were there, right? And they showed up very quickly. Again, just like, we don't want you to see the border. We're trying to have this be something that is out of sight. I'm not sure what the next picture is. Okay, so you can keep this up. We'll get you all hungry right before lunch. But the detention center and the Borderfield State Park and Friendship Park, which is that garden that was mentioned on the Tijuana side, just a few years ago, it's called Friendship Park because you were able to access the border wall from both sides. And there's actually a border church that would meet and they would do communion through the slots in the border wall. And over the years, they've put metal, like mesh, in the wall so you can barely get like a pinky through. So like you can no longer do communion because you can't get anything through. And then they've made that second wall with a gap in between. And so it used to be, like there used to be picnic benches on the California side, and you could actually see your relatives or your friends on the other side of the border, and they've gradually pushed that back even further. They did say with the new wall that they built, they got some verbal and maybe written agreements that they have a door in the wall, and they're considering opening that in between for like a couple hours for people to do that interaction again. But between not being able to go to Borderfield State Park and having Friendship Park so changed, those things really got me again of this, we're trying to push this out of your mind. We're trying to make it that you can't access. If you're on the California side, you can't get close enough to the border to even be aware of the realities that are going on. And as we'll share more, Journey Home's whole point, I mean, they wanted us to learn about the realities on this border, but it was not like, here are your 10 steps for policy reform. Like, that was not the point. The point was, what does this teach us about borders? What does this teach us about division? And how does that impact us as followers of Jesus wherever we are? The Mexico-US border was just a context for that learning. And I think that stuck out to me so much, that there are so many people and so many issues that we try to push to the side, or that get pushed to the side. And when I look at the life of Jesus, he is constantly crossing those things. He is seeking out. He's not saying like, I don't really know what's going on with the Samaritans these days. Like, I just haven't learned about it. Like, he goes and seeks them out, right? He is trying to pursue those things. And so for me, this was an opportunity to say, this is a big topic in our country, and there is hate on all sides. And as a follower of Jesus, I want to go and see it for myself. And not that this 2-day trip makes me an expert, but it gets me a little closer to say, what does it mean to be a follower of Jesus who is aware of this actual reality and the realities in my office and in my neighborhood and with my friends, where there are borders that I would much rather just put out in East County and ignore them, right? And so I think for me, part of my takeaway is to continue to seek those things that are easy to avoid, and to ask God what it means to actively learn and actively step into them, even when it's painful and uncomfortable. And it's a lot easier to not know, right? But I don't think that's what we see from Jesus. So those are some of my highlights bleeding into my reflections.
I'll share my reflection and then. This was this year, February, right? It's like not that long ago, but it's so easy to come back to, have a little debrief, and then you forget. You go on with your daily life, right? But it's good to keep coming back to it. We came back to it again when we met with the luncheon. We're coming back to it now. And my hope is that, moving forward, that we keep coming back to this topic and topics like this. And, before coming up here, I was nervous. I'm still nervous. I don't know why. I'm used to talking to kids, not to adults. But just looking out in our church, and I was telling Ruthie, like, it's just our family. It's our church family I'm talking to, right? And so grateful that this is the church that our family is part of, that we are open and welcome these topics and these experiences, right? So grateful that, our past partnership has led to this partnership with Journey Home that has allowed us, totally different backgrounds and initiatives of going, but we were part of this little team, and I'm so grateful for that, and hoping that it'll be an encouragement to other members of the church when it comes up again, to be like, yeah, like, hey, Tanya did it, and that's kind of crazy, or whatnot, but not crazy, right? It's not crazy. That's what's great about it. It's so doable. Took one day off of work and was home by Saturday night, right? And so it's so doable, but it's opening up your heart and your eyes to something that's bigger than ourselves. And like my peers growing up were Hispanic and Asian, and there's so much of the immigrant story but we never talked about it. It was just something like we don't talk about. And I work in Westminster, and there's lots of families I'm sure going through so much, but yet still there's like we don't talk about it because I think there's lack of like that safety of, you're on my side, right? And I want to be like, I'm on your side. So
Yeah.
Thank you. I agree with everything. I think in the midst of thinking about all these overwhelming issues, one verse that came to mind was from John chapter 1 that says, "The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it." And I felt that we did see many points of light on this trip. That leads to this picture of my plate of food that is Haitian food. It was from a restaurant from Haitian immigrants who made a life for themselves and were so joyful in serving us and welcoming us. And other points of light were our hosts, Alejandra and Pedro, and the Border Angels, another organization, and Journey Home. And for me, even this group that we traveled with, they were really a point of light to me because their hearts were so genuine and compassionate and eager to learn. Which ironically leads me to my next point, which is that for me personally, I ended up being triggered in many ways. One reason is because several people asked me, so why do you feel solidarity with people who are stereotyped? And which again, wonderful, learning is so wonderful and necessary, but practically what ends up happening is that I retell all of my stories of microaggressions and racist things that happened, and then the listener can file it away as so very interesting and shut the door and move on with their life. And then I'm kind of left feeling re-traumatized, and that is my life. Another thing that happened was that the trip ended with a big group reflection. And one thing that kind of came out of it was that there is a general sense of trying to keep people out of this country. And it's not because of practical societal reasons, but it kind of comes out of a superiority complex. And so my hope in thinking about all of this is that as Christians in this nation, that we could approach these issues with humility and with compassion. I guess one example that came up, even recently after this trip was that a handful of people were talking about polluted water coming up from Mexico. And I think having gone on this trip, it made me feel more like, hey, those are my friends you're talking about. And I just felt that, not that the issues were inaccurate, but the tone, the underlying tone of the conversation was very undignifying to Mexico. And so I feel like in these ways, as we learn about these things, we can kind of change the tone of the conversation and refocus on, hey, we have shared priorities, we have shared interests in having safe and sanitary conditions for all people. As Katie mentioned, the emphasis of the trip was not that everyone has to become a border activist now, but it was rather, how are we being formed as people? And in fact, on this trip, there's a quiet sense that God can be trusted with all of these issues. And so the way the organization frames it is how are we being formed? What are the borders in our own lives, could be internal or external, that God is inviting us to cross? Next slide, please. And that is, what borders are we invited to cross in our own neighborhoods? That was the general theme, and that's pretty much it for our presentation, and we really just wanted to thank everybody. A lot of people really supported us financially and in prayer, and we're so thankful and appreciative of all of you. Thank you so much. And